So the other day, I was listening to this speech from Dr. King called, "Where Do We Go From Here?" It was delivered 10 years after the passing of the Civil Rights Act, which made it illegal for schools to stay segregated and supported efforts for black people to get the right to vote. Now, 10 years after the Civil Rights Act is passed, Dr. King steps up behind a podium and gives his assessment on the progress of the civil rights movement thus far. And he says this: "The black man escaped his struggle, only barely integrated. For 10 years of progress, the problem is still far from solved." And I think it's important for people to hear Dr. King, in his own words, assessing the progress of the civil rights movement, because a lot of people these days like to act as though America's race problem is a fact of history, that it ended when schools were segregated or when the laws to give black people the right to vote had been ratified. But even the people who were living at that time, who witnessed those changes happen, who were on the front lines of seeing those things happen, were looking at the problem and saying, no, that was not the end, it was just the beginning. Dr. King goes on in that speech to name all of these different ways that the race problem continued to thrive 10 years after the passing of the Civil Rights Act. He says black people are still being lynched, that black people still were living under this presumption of dangerousness and guilt that made them vulnerable to all kinds of violence, that centuries of economic oppression and exploitation had created this inequality in American society that kept black people locked into a certain lower position in the American caste system. He talks about how the race problem is deep and vast and complicated and pervading everything from the way that we teach children to talk about the colors black and white in school, up unto the social conditions that create and maintain the ghetto, up unto how the Vietnam War was particularly destructive to the black community. And as I'm listening to him speak, I'm realizing that if he were still alive, Dr. King could stand behind a podium today and he could deliver that same speech and his analysis of culture would still be accurate. I mean, this week alone, we've seen a racially motivated mass shooting. We've seen an act of racial intimidation against a historically black sorority. We've seen the senseless killing of a black boy in Dallas. We've gotten the news that the men who killed Alton Sterling and Walter Scott will probably not face the consequences that the average civilian would if they had murdered someone. And yet many Americans fail to see that there is a pattern to these events, that these events have a genealogy, that they are leaves on the sprawling branches of a very old and immense tree of racial injustice in this country. And to talk about each of those events in turn would make a super long video, so I'm just going to talk about Jordan Edwards. This 15-year-old boy was leaving a pool party because it got out of hand, and a police officer shot him with a rifle. When I think about this story, I can't help but feel like this kid was killed like wild game. And the most maddening thing about it is that there really was no reason why this kid was shot. The officer did lie about it and said that the car that Jordan Edwards was in was backing up towards them aggressively, presumably so that he could say that he feared for his life and so he shot into the car. But that would still be a bullshit excuse because there are plenty of ways to not get hit by a car without killing those who are occupying the vehicle. So then why did this officer shoot at them? Now, if I say that this police officer killed this little boy because he was black, people are going to think that I'm saying that that officer had to have personal hatred in his heart toward black people. But the officer doesn't have to have any personal negative feelings against black people in order for this to be an example of how racism continues to thrive in our society. All that has to be true is that that type of death is more likely to happen to black people, and it is 5 times more likely to happen to black people. So let's be clear. That man shot at that car because in America, it's normal for police officers to try to stop civilians with bullets, especially certain types of civilians in certain types of neighborhoods. It is just a fact that an officer knows they better have a damn good reason for discharging their firearm in Beverly Hills, and that type of scrutiny and trepidation is not so much a concern in a neighborhood like Watts or the projects in Atlanta or Baltimore or Northwest Pasadena. So the officer shot at that vehicle because he felt a certain kind of freedom that he wouldn't have necessarily felt in another context. And that freedom is the consequence of a cultural deficit of value on neighborhoods and people of color. That freedom is also the consequence of the reality that law enforcement officers are generally not tried and punished like the average civilian for murdering someone. That freedom is also the result of law enforcement, courts, the media having the power to come together and cover up gross miscarriages of justice, and they often do. So I say all that to say that it doesn't matter how the officer feels about black people. It's this network of police militarism and racial prejudices and government corruption and so on working together to create this atmosphere, this social reality of racial injustice. And American people need to come to grips with the fact that that is the type of society that we live in. A society where people continue to suffer because of the color of their skin, where civilians are literally hunted by those who are sworn to serve and protect them, and where systems and policies are set in place to protect that social order and those who participate in it and those who profit from it. It's time for people to wake up and realize that America has yet to live into its creeds and songs about being a place of liberty and justice and equality and freedom for everyone. It's time to wake up and realize that the world doesn't have to be this way and that we can change things if we will choose to resist the current program. But people can't solve a problem that they're unwilling to admit that they have.